The morning sun stretched across the small town of Cedar Falls, Minnesota, painting the snow-dusted streets in shades of gold and amber. It was the kind of December morning that made you believe in the simple beauty of ordinary days, the kind that smelled like pine trees and wood smoke and the promise of something good just around the corner. The town itself was nothing remarkable to outside eyes. A population of about 4,000 souls, a main street lined with locally owned shops, a library that had been funded by a Carnegie grant a century ago, and 3 churches of different denominations that somehow managed to coexist without the theological disputes that plagued larger communities. There was 1 grocery store, 1 hardware store, 2 gas stations, and Rosie's Diner, which had been serving breakfast to the citizens of Cedar Falls for 43 years and showed no signs of stopping. The diner sat on the corner of Main and 4th, a brick building with large windows that fogged up in the winter and a neon sign that flickered on cold nights. Inside, the booths were covered in red vinyl that had been reupholstered twice in the diner's history, and the counter was made of genuine formica, worn smooth by decades of coffee cups and forearms and the gentle friction of community. Fire Captain Daniel Morrison pushed through the doors of Rosie's Diner at exactly 7:15 a.m., same as he'd done every Saturday morning for the past 18 years. The bell above the door chimed its familiar greeting, and the warmth of the diner wrapped around him like a welcome embrace, chasing away the bitter cold that had followed him inside. Daniel stomped the snow off his boots on the worn mat by the door, a habit ingrained from decades of Minnesota winters. The cold this morning had been brutal, the kind that made your nose hairs freeze the moment you stepped outside, the kind that made you grateful for warm buildings and hot coffee and the simple pleasure of being indoors. He'd been up since 5, unable to sleep, his mind churning with thoughts about the upcoming Christmas holiday and the end-of-year reports he still needed to file at the station. At 52, sleep didn't come as easily as it once had. His body ached in places it never used to ache, and the years of running into burning buildings had left their mark on his joints and his lungs. The department doctor had started making noises about retirement, about taking it easy, about letting the younger guys handle the dangerous calls. Daniel listened politely and ignored every word. "Morning, Danny," Rosie Chen called from behind the counter, already reaching for his usual mug. She was a small woman in her 60s, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, her apron bearing the stains of 1,000 breakfasts lovingly prepared. "The usual. You know it, Rosie." Daniel slid onto his regular stool at the counter, the worn leather seat molded to his shape after years of Saturday morning visits. "Cold one out there today. 20 below, they're saying. Coldest December in 30 years. Rosie poured his coffee, the steam rising in lazy spirals. "You boys stay warm out there at the station." "We do our best." The diner was filling up with its usual Saturday crowd. Farmers in worn Carhartt jackets discussing cattle prices over plates of eggs and bacon. A young couple in the corner booth holding hands across the table, lost in that particular glow of new love. Old Mrs. Patterson by the window, working on her crossword puzzle the way she had every Saturday morning since her husband passed. Daniel loved this place, loved the familiar faces, the comfortable rhythms, the sense of belonging that came from being part of a community where everyone knew your name and your story. He'd grown up in Cedar Falls, joined the volunteer fire department at 18, worked his way up to captain by 40. Now, at 52, he couldn't imagine living anywhere else. His life had followed a pattern that he found deeply satisfying. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Margaret, the summer after graduation. They'd raised 2 daughters in a modest house on Elm Street, put them both through college, and watched with pride as they'd built lives of their own. His eldest, Catherine, was a teacher in Minneapolis. His youngest, Susan, worked as an accountant in St. Paul. Both were married now, and Catherine had given him a grandson who called him Poppy and made his heart melt every time. The fire department had been his calling from the moment he'd seen them put out a barn fire on the Johnson property when he was 9 years old. The bravery, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. It had captured his imagination and never let go. 34 years later, he still felt the same rush of adrenaline when the alarm sounded, the same pride when he pulled up to a scene in the big red truck, the same satisfaction when a job was done well. But Saturdays were sacred. No calls unless it was an emergency. Just him, his breakfast, and the quiet ritual of being part of something larger than himself. His breakfast arrived, delivered by Rosie's daughter Jenny, a pretty woman in her 30s who'd taken over most of the day-to-day operations of the diner. 2 eggs over easy, bacon crispy, hash browns golden, and wheat toast with strawberry jam. The same breakfast he'd ordered for nearly 2 decades. "How's that grandson of yours?" Jenny asked, refilling his coffee. "Growing like a weed. Turned 5 last month, already talking about wanting to be a firefighter like his grandpa." Daniel's face softened at the mention of his grandson. His mom's not too thrilled about that idea. Jenny laughed. "Can't imagine why. Such a safe, boring profession." They shared a smile, the easy camaraderie of people who'd known each other their whole lives. Daniel was halfway through his eggs when the bell above the door chimed again. He glanced up out of habit, the way small-town people always do when someone enters a room, cataloguing faces, noting who's new, who belongs. The woman who walked in didn't belong. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Her coat was thin for the weather, a faded blue parka that had seen better days. The kind of coat that might be adequate for a mild autumn but offered little protection against a Minnesota December. Behind her, clutching her hand, was a little girl of about 4 or 5, bundled in a pink jacket that was clearly too small, her mittens mismatched, one red and one green. The contrast between them and the other diners was stark. Everyone else wore proper winter gear, the heavy-duty parkas and insulated boots that were standard issue for life in this part of the country. Everyone else moved with the easy confidence of people who belonged, who knew the menu by heart, who had their usual seats and their usual orders and their usual conversations. This woman moved like a deer in headlights, hyper-aware of her surroundings, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Daniel recognized that posture. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of people who'd lost everything in fires, in the faces of accident victims who were still in shock, in the body language of those who had learned the hard way that the world could be cruel and unpredictable. The little girl was different. Children often are. She looked around the diner with wide-eyed curiosity, taking in the Christmas decorations that Jenny had hung from every available surface, the garlands and the lights, and the small tree in the corner covered in ornaments made by local schoolchildren. There was wonder in her eyes, the pure, unself-conscious wonder that only young children possess. The woman paused just inside the door, her eyes scanning the diner with the wary alertness of someone who wasn't sure they were welcome. The little girl pressed closer to her mother's leg, peering out at the unfamiliar faces with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Something about them made Daniel's chest tighten. He'd seen that look before, too many times. The look of people on the edge, people barely holding on, people one bad break away from falling through the cracks entirely. The woman led her daughter to a small table near the back, away from the windows and the other customers. She helped the little girl out of her jacket, revealing a threadbare sweater underneath, then sat down across from her, picking up a menu and studying it with intense concentration. Daniel turned back to his breakfast, but found he'd lost his appetite. He kept glancing toward the back table, watching the woman's face as she looked at the menu, watching the way her expression shifted from hope to something else as she scanned the prices. Jenny approached their table with her order pad. "Good morning. Welcome to Rosie's. What can I get for you two?" The woman looked up and Daniel saw her swallow hard. Could I just see the children's menu?" Of course. Jenny handed over a laminated sheet with cartoon animals and bright colors. Our kids' pancakes are really popular. Comes with a smiley face made of whipped cream. The little girl's eyes lit up at the mention of pancakes. Mommy, can I have pancakes, please? The woman's smile was strained. Let's see what they have, sweetie. Maybe something smaller. She studied the children's menu, and Daniel watched her face fall as she calculated prices in her head. Watched her dig through her purse and count the crumpled bills inside. Watched her close her eyes for just a moment, gathering herself before looking up at Jenny with an expression that broke his heart. Actually, the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper, could I just get a glass of water for her? And maybe... She hesitated, her cheeks flushing with shame. Do you have any expired cake or pastries? Anything you were going to throw away? I can pay a little for it, just something for my daughter. It's her birthday. The diner went quiet. Not all at once, but in a ripple that spread from table to table as people registered what they'd heard. Conversations trailed off, forks paused halfway to mouths. Even the country music playing softly from the old jukebox seemed to fade into the background. Daniel felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Expired cake for her daughter's birthday, because that was all she could afford. He looked at the little girl, at her hopeful eyes, and her too small jacket and her mismatched mittens. Looked at the mother, whose face had gone crimson with humiliation as she realized everyone had heard. Watched her shoulders curl inward, making herself smaller, as if she could disappear into the worn vinyl of the booth. Jenny stood frozen, her order pad clutched in her hand, clearly unsure how to respond. The silence stretched on, heavy and awkward and unbearable. And then Daniel Morrison, fire captain, 52 years old, father of 2, grandfather of 1, did something he would remember for the rest of his life. He stood up from his stool at the counter, picked up his coffee mug, and walked to the back of the diner. The walk felt longer than it should have, each step weighted with significance he couldn't quite name. He was aware of eyes following him, aware of the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby tables, aware that he was about to cross some invisible line between minding his own business and getting involved. But he kept walking. Because somewhere deep in his bones, in that place where instinct lived, he knew that this was one of those moments. One of those choices that would define who he was and what he stood for. He could stay in his seat, finish his breakfast, go home and never think about this woman and her daughter again. Or he could get up. He could walk across the room. He could do something. Daniel Morrison was not the kind of man who stayed in his seat. Without asking permission, he slid into the booth next to the little girl, setting his mug on the table, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, looking at the woman with a gentle smile. "Eating breakfast alone gets boring after a while." The woman stared at him, her eyes wide with confusion and the beginning of tears. I don't... I'm Daniel," he said, extending his hand. "Danny to my friends. And who's this young lady?" The little girl looked up at him with those big, trusting eyes that only children have. "I'm Emma. It's my birthday today. I'm 5. 5 years old. Well, happy birthday, Emma. That's a very important age." Daniel turned to Jenny, who was still standing there, looking like she might cry herself. "Jenny, I think this calls for a celebration. How about you bring out 3 of your biggest stacks of birthday pancakes, with all the fixings, whipped cream, strawberries, the works, and hot chocolate for the birthday girl." "Danny, you don't have to," the woman started, her voice breaking. "I know I don't have to," Daniel said softly. "I want to. Please, let me do this." For a long moment the woman just looked at him, looked at this stranger who had inserted himself into her shame and was trying to transform it into something else. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she wiped at them with the back of her hand. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't even know us." Daniel thought about that question, thought about all the fires he'd fought, all the people he'd pulled from burning buildings, all the lives he'd saved and the ones he couldn't. Thought about the community that had raised him, The neighbors who had helped his family when times were tough, the countless small kindnesses that had shaped him into who he was. "Because it's what we do here," he said simply. "We look out for each other. That's what Cedar Falls is all about." The woman's name was Sarah Mitchell. She'd moved to Minnesota 6 months ago, fleeing a bad situation in Ohio, a marriage that had turned violent, a husband who had controlled every aspect of her life until she'd finally found the courage to take her daughter and run. She told Daniel her story over pancakes, the words spilling out of her like water from a broken dam. How she'd arrived in Cedar Falls with nothing but a suitcase and $200. How she'd found a job at the local grocery store, stocking shelves at night while Emma slept in the break room. How the apartment they were renting was barely heated, and the car she'd bought with her savings had broken down last week, and she'd spent her last $40 on the repair. The details came in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that assembled themselves into a picture of quiet desperation. She'd chosen Cedar Falls almost at random, she admitted. She'd been driving north, putting miles between herself and Marcus, her ex-husband, and she'd stopped for gas and seen the help wanted sign in the grocery store window. It had seemed like a sign from the universe, a chance to start over. He wasn't always like that, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When we first met, he was charming, sweet, attentive. I thought I'd found my soulmate." She laughed bitterly. "Isn't that what they all say? The warning signs were there, I just didn't want to see them. The way he'd get jealous if I talked to other men. The way he'd criticize little things, then apologize and tell me he just wanted me to be the best version of myself. The way he slowly cut me off from my friends, my family, everyone who might have helped me see what was happening." Daniel listened without interrupting, understanding that sometimes the greatest gift you could give someone was simply the space to speak. "The first time he hit me, I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. This man who said he loved me, who brought me flowers and wrote me poems, who could be so gentle and tender, had struck me across the face because I'd burned dinner." Sarah's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "He cried afterward, begged me to forgive him, promised it would never happen again, and I believed him. I wanted to believe him so badly." "How long were you married?" Daniel asked gently. 7 years. Emma was born 3 years in. For a while I thought having a child might change things. It didn't." Sarah's voice hardened. "It got worse, actually. The sleep deprivation, the stress of a new baby, the pressure. He took it out on me. Never on Emma, thank God. He never touched her. But she saw things, heard things no child should have to witness. She told him about the night she'd finally left. The night Marcus had gone too far, had knocked her unconscious, had stood over her with a look in his eyes that told her if she didn't get out, she might not survive. She'd waited until he was asleep, packed what she could carry, strapped Emma into the car seat, and driven away without looking back. "I just wanted to give her a birthday," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just one normal day. One day where she didn't have to worry about anything. I saved up for weeks, but then the car broke down, and I had to choose between fixing it so I could get to work or—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "She's been so good, Danny, through everything. She never complains. She just keeps smiling, keeps telling me everything's going to be okay. She's 5 years old, and she's the one comforting me." Daniel looked at Emma, who was happily working her way through a stack of pancakes taller than her head, whipped cream on her nose, and strawberry syrup on her chin. She was telling Jenny about her favorite cartoon, chattering away as if this were the best day of her life. Maybe it was. "Where's her father now?" Daniel asked carefully. "I don't know. I got a restraining order, but—" Sarah shrugged. "I try not to think about it. I just focus on Emma, on keeping her safe, on building a new life." "That takes courage," Daniel said. "More courage than most people have." Sarah laughed, a bitter sound. "It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like barely surviving. Like drowning, and somehow managing to keep my head above water, but just barely." She looked down at her coffee cup, at the steam rising from the surface. I'm sorry. You didn't come here to listen to my problems. You came for breakfast, and I ruined your morning. You didn't ruin anything, Daniel said firmly. And you're not drowning, Sarah. You're swimming. There's a difference. The breakfast crowd at Rosie's diner had been watching the scene unfold from the corners of their eyes. Small-town people were like that, observant without being intrusive, curious but respectful. They'd heard Sarah's story, passed in whispers from table to table, and something was happening in the room. A shift. A decision being made collectively, the way small communities sometimes do, without words, but with perfect understanding. Old Mrs. Patterson was the first to move. She set down her crossword puzzle, gathered up her purse, and walked over to the booth where Daniel sat with Sarah and Emma. "Excuse me, dear," she said to Sarah, her voice gentle but firm. "I couldn't help but overhear. I'm Helen Patterson. I live over on Maple Street, the blue house with the white shutters. I don't drive anymore, too old for that nonsense, but I've got a car sitting in my garage gathering dust. A Honda Civic, only 60,000 miles on it. My son keeps telling me to sell it, but I've never gotten around to it." Sarah looked confused. "I don't understand. What I'm saying, dear, is that car is yours if you want it. No charge. It's just taking up space anyway." Sarah's jaw dropped. "Mrs. Patterson, I can't." "You can, and you will." Helen's tone left no room for argument. "I'll have my son bring it by wherever you're staying. Just give me the address." Before Sarah could respond, another figure appeared at the table. Tom Hendricks, owner of the hardware store on Main Street. A burly man with a grey beard and kind eyes. "I heard you mention your apartment's got heating problems," he said. "I've got a space heater sitting in my stockroom, brand new, still in the box. Someone ordered it and never picked it up. I'll drop it off this afternoon. And my wife's sister works for the county, does something with housing assistance. I'll have her give you a call, see if there's any programs that might help." "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, overwhelmed. "Don't say anything," Tom replied. "Just pay it forward someday when you can." One by one, the people of Rosie's diner came to the table. The young couple from the corner booth, pressing a $20 bill into Sarah's hand. A farmer offering part-time work on his property if she ever needed extra income. The owner of the clothing store on 5th Street, promising to bring by some winter clothes that would fit Emma properly. The Johnsons, a retired couple who had raised 7 children and knew something about making ends meet, offered to babysit Emma whenever Sarah needed. "Free of charge," Mrs. Johnson insisted. "We've got more love to give than we know what to do with since our grandkids moved away." Bob Miller, who ran the auto shop on the edge of town, handed Sarah his business card. "You bring that car of yours to me next time it acts up. I'll take care of it. No charge. And I mean it, so don't you argue with me." Even old Frank Peterson, the grumpiest man in Cedar Falls by common consensus, shuffled over to the table and pressed a worn $50 bill into Sarah's hand without a word. When she tried to thank him, he just grunted and walked away. But Daniel saw the shine in his eyes, the softening of his perpetual scowl. The pastor from the Lutheran church, Pastor Erickson, happened to be having breakfast with his wife. He approached with a gentle smile and information about the church's food pantry, their clothing closet, their emergency assistance fund. "No judgment, no questions asked," he assured her. "That's what we're here for." Jenny came back with a birthday cake, a real one, covered in pink frosting and lit with 5 candles. It wasn't just any cake, Daniel noticed. It was the special cake Rosie's made for occasions. 3 layers of chocolate with buttercream frosting and hand-piped decorations. The kind that cost $30 and had to be ordered in advance. "On the house," she said, setting it in front of Emma. "Every birthday girl deserves a real cake." Emma's eyes went wide as saucers. "Mommy, look! A cake! A real cake!" Sarah was crying now, not even trying to hide it. The tears streamed down her face as she looked around at these strangers who had become something else entirely in the span of an hour. These people who had seen her shame and responded with grace, who had witnessed her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up. "I don't understand," she kept saying. "I don't understand why you're all doing this." Daniel put his hand on her shoulder. "Because that's who we are. That's who we choose to be. And because Emma deserves a good birthday. Every kid does." "Make a wish, sweetie," Sarah managed, her voice thick with tears. "Blow out the candles." Emma closed her eyes tight, her face scrunched in concentration. Then she opened them, took a deep breath, and blew. All 5 candles went out at once, and the diner erupted in applause. "What did you wish for?" Daniel asked. Emma looked up at him with those innocent eyes. "I can't tell you. Then it won't come true." But something in her smile made Daniel think she hadn't wished for toys or games or any of the things most 5-year-olds wanted. Something in her smile made him think she'd wished for exactly what was happening right now, for her mother to stop crying, for people to be kind, for the world to be a little less scary. Maybe wishes did come true sometimes. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked around the diner at all the faces turned toward them. Some people had tears in their eyes too. Others wore expressions of quiet satisfaction, the look of people who had done something good and knew it. A few were taking photos, capturing the moment for posterity, for social media, for the simple human need to document kindness when they saw it. "I don't know how to thank you all," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I came in here today expecting nothing, less than nothing. I expected to be turned away, maybe laughed at, maybe told to leave. Instead, you've given my daughter the best birthday she's ever had. You've given us hope. You've shown us that there are still good people in the world." Jenny stepped forward, putting a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Honey, this is what Cedar Falls does. We take care of each other. It's not charity, it's not pity. It's just who we are. And now, you're one of us too." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of cake and conversation and community. People came and went, each one stopping by the table to introduce themselves, to offer help, to welcome Sarah and Emma to Cedar Falls. By the time the breakfast rush ended, Sarah had a list of phone numbers, as long as her arm, more resources than she knew what to do with, and something she hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. Daniel walked them out to the parking lot, carrying the leftover cake, while Sarah held Emma's hand. The little girl was wearing a new pink hat that someone had given her, pulled down over her ears against the cold. In her other hand, she clutched a teddy bear that Mrs. Johnson had produced from somewhere, claiming she'd been meaning to find a good home for it anyway. The parking lot was covered in fresh snow, sparkling in the morning sunlight like a field of diamonds. The air was still bitterly cold, but it didn't seem to matter anymore. Something warm had been kindled inside that diner, something that no amount of winter weather could extinguish. Sarah's old car sat at the far end of the lot, looking even more battered in the bright light of day. It was a 15-year-old sedan with rust spots on the doors and a crack in the windshield that spiderwebbed across the driver's side. But it ran, Daniel reminded himself. It got her to work and back. And now, thanks to Mrs. Patterson, she wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. "Thank you," Sarah said, turning to face him. "I don't even know how to thank you." "All of you. You don't have to thank anyone," Daniel said. "Just get yourself settled. Take care of that little girl, and if you ever need anything, you know where to find us." "Why did you do it?" Sarah asked. "I saw you at the counter. You didn't have to get up. You didn't have to say anything. You could have just let me leave with a glass of water and a memory of the worst moment of my life. Why did you choose to do something?" Daniel considered the question. He thought about his own life, about the moments that had shaped him, about the choices that had made him who he was. "When I was 12 years old," he said slowly, "my father lost his job at the mill. It was the only work he'd ever known, and when it closed down, he didn't know what to do. We lost our house. Had to move into this tiny apartment above the hardware store. I remember going to school in clothes that didn't fit, eating lunch that was just bread and butter because that's all we had." He paused, the memory still sharp after all these years. "One day, I came home from school, and there were bags of groceries on our doorstep. No note, no explanation, just food. enough to last a month. And new clothes for me and my sister, exactly the right sizes. We never found out who did it. My parents asked around, but nobody would admit to it. Sarah was listening intently, her eyes fixed on his face. That was the moment I learned something important, Daniel continued. I learned that kindness doesn't need credit, that you can change someone's life without them ever knowing who you are. That the best things we do for each other are often the quietest ones. He smiled. I've spent my whole life trying to be worthy of whoever left those groceries on our porch, trying to pay forward what they gave my family. Did you ever find out who it was? Daniel shook his head. Never, but I think about them sometimes, wonder if they're still alive, if they know what a difference they made. My father got back on his feet eventually, started his own business, did pretty well for himself. But those bags of groceries kept us going during the hardest time, kept us together, kept us from giving up. He looked at Emma, who was trying to catch snowflakes on her tongue, completely unaware of the weight of the conversation happening above her head. Years from now, she probably won't remember today, Daniel said. She won't remember the pancakes or the cake or the faces of the people who helped. But she'll remember the feeling. She'll remember that when things were hard, strangers showed up and made it better. And maybe someday when she's grown and she sees someone struggling, she'll remember that feeling and she'll do the same thing. Sarah was crying again, but these were different tears. Lighter somehow, healing. Thank you, Danny, she said. Not just for the breakfast, for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible, for treating me like I mattered. You do matter, Daniel said firmly. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't. He watched them drive away in Sarah's old car, the one that had cost her last $40 to fix. Watched until the taillights disappeared around the corner, carrying a mother and daughter toward a future that suddenly looked a little brighter. The cold bit into him as he stood there, but he didn't mind. There was a warmth inside him that no winter could touch, a sense of rightness that he hadn't felt in a long time. He thought about all the calls he'd responded to over the years, all the emergencies and disasters and moments of crisis. He'd saved lives, yes. He'd done work that mattered, but somehow this morning felt different, more personal, more profound. Maybe it was because this time there was no fire to fight, no obvious danger to face, just a quiet moment of need and a choice to respond. Anyone could have done what he did. Anyone in that diner could have gotten up, walked across the room, sat down with a stranger. But they hadn't. He had. And that simple act had unlocked something in the community, had given permission for everyone else's kindness to flow. It made him think about all the times he'd walked past someone in need, all the moments when he'd been too busy, too distracted, too wrapped up in his own concerns to notice the person right in front of him who was struggling. How many Sarahs had he missed? How many Emmas had blown out candles on imaginary cakes because no one had taken the time to see them? The thought was uncomfortable. But discomfort, Daniel had learned, was often the precursor to growth. Then he went back inside to pay his bill. Rosie was waiting for him at the counter, her arms crossed, a knowing look on her face. You did a good thing today, Danny Morrison. Wasn't just me. It was everyone. True, but you started it. You got up, you walked over, you sat down. She shook her head slowly. That's how it works, you know. Someone has to go first. Someone has to be willing to look foolish, to risk rejection, to do the thing that everyone else is thinking about but nobody wants to actually do. You were that person today. Daniel thought about that as he pulled out his wallet. Just seemed like the right thing to do. That's because it was. Rosie waved away his money. Your breakfast is on the house today. Consider it my contribution. Rosie, you can't keep giving away food. You've got a business to run. I've been running this business for 40 years, Danny. I think I know what I'm doing. She smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. Some things are more important than profit margins. Today was one of those things. Daniel left the diner and walked to his truck, his boots crunching on the frozen snow. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he hardly noticed. His mind was still back in that booth, still seeing Sarah's face transform from shame to wonder as the community wrapped itself around her. He thought about all the people who walked through the world like Sarah, invisible, struggling, carrying burdens no one could see. How many of them passed by every day, right under his nose, and he never noticed? How many opportunities for kindness did he miss because he was too busy, too distracted, too wrapped up in his own life? It was a sobering thought. That evening, Daniel sat in his living room with his wife, Margaret, telling her about the morning's events. They'd been married for 30 years, raised 2 daughters together, built a life in this small town that both of them loved. She listened without interrupting, her knitting needles clicking softly as he talked. When he finished, she set down her work and looked at him with those blue eyes that still made his heart skip after all these years. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "It wasn't just me, everyone helped. I know, but you started it. That takes something special." She reached over and took his hand. "Your father would have been proud too. He always said you had a good heart." The mention of his father brought a lump to Daniel's throat. Edward Morrison had passed 5 years ago, peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a legacy of hard work and quiet kindness that Daniel tried every day to honor. His father had been a carpenter, a man who built things with his hands and never sought recognition for the countless small kindnesses he performed throughout his life. A porch repaired for a widow who couldn't afford a contractor. A bookshelf built for the library when they couldn't afford to buy one. A lifetime of showing up, of helping out, of being the kind of man others could depend on. "I keep thinking about those groceries," Daniel said. "The ones that showed up on our porch when I was a kid. Whoever did that, they never knew what it meant to us. Never knew how it changed everything." "Maybe that was the point," Margaret suggested. "Maybe the gift was in the not knowing, in doing something good without expecting anything in return." Daniel nodded slowly. "I've spent 40 years trying to be worthy of that gift. Today, it felt like maybe I came a little closer. You did more than that, Danny. You showed that woman and her daughter that the world can be kind, that people can be good. That's not a small thing. In fact, it might be the biggest thing of all." Margaret set aside her knitting and moved closer to him on the couch. "You know what I remember about that time? When your family was struggling, I remember how scared your mother looked, how thin your father got because he was giving his food to you kids, how you wore the same clothes to school every day until the neighbors started talking." Daniel nodded. He remembered too. The shame of poverty, the constant anxiety, the feeling that one more setback would send them over the edge entirely. "And then the groceries appeared," Margaret continued, "and your mother cried for an hour. Not sad tears, relief tears, hope tears. I remember your father standing on the porch, looking out at the street like he was trying to spot whoever had done it. And he just kept shaking his head and saying, 'People are good, people are so good.'" "I never knew you knew about all that," Daniel said softly. "Of course I knew. The whole town knew, but nobody talked about it because that's not what you do. You don't embarrass people by pointing out their struggles. You just help, quietly, and let them keep their dignity." She squeezed his hand. "That's what you did today. You let Sarah keep her dignity while still giving her what she needed. That's the hardest kind of kindness to give." They sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, the snow falling softly outside the window. It was the kind of moment that made up a life, the kind that you didn't appreciate until you were old enough to know how rare and precious they were. The weeks that followed brought changes to Cedar Falls that no one could have predicted. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had walked into Rosie's diner looking for expired cake, became something of a local legend. Not because of what had happened to her, but because of what she did with it. She took Mrs. Patterson's Honda Civic and drove it to work every day, arriving early and staying late, determined to prove herself. She took Tom Hendricks's space heater and used it to make her tiny apartment warm enough for Emma to play without wearing 3 layers of clothes. She took the phone numbers and the resources and the offers of help, and she built a life. The transformation wasn't instant. There were setbacks and struggles, days when the weight of everything felt too heavy to bear, days when she wondered if she'd made a mistake leaving Ohio, if she should have stayed and tried harder to make things work, days when the old fear crept back in, the fear that she wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't worthy of the kindness being shown to her. But on those days, she would remember the diner, remember the faces of the people who had surrounded her table, remember Daniel Morrison sliding into the booth beside her daughter and ordering birthday pancakes like it was the most natural thing in the world. And she would find the strength to keep going. Emma flourished in ways that made Sarah's heart ache with gratitude. She started at the local elementary school and immediately made friends, her natural warmth and resilience drawing other children to her like a magnet. Her teacher, Mrs. Olson, called Sarah after the first week to say that Emma was one of the brightest, kindest students she'd ever had. "Whatever you're doing," Mrs. Olson said, "keep doing it. That child has something special." Sarah wanted to explain that she wasn't doing anything special. She was just surviving day by day, trying to build something good out of the wreckage of her past. But maybe that was special. Maybe the act of surviving, of getting up every morning and trying again, was its own kind of heroism. But more than that, she paid it forward. Every Saturday morning, Sarah showed up at Rosie's diner with Emma in tow. They'd order breakfast, real breakfast now that Sarah could afford it, and they'd sit at the same booth where everything had changed. And every Saturday, without fail, Sarah would find someone who looked like she had looked that first morning. Someone tired, someone struggling, someone on the edge. And she would do what Daniel had done for her. "Mind if I join you?" she would ask. Eating breakfast alone gets boring after a while. It became a thing, a tradition, a movement of sorts, though no one ever called it that. People started coming to Rosie's diner on Saturday mornings, not just for the food, but for the possibility of being part of something larger than themselves. The possibility of witnessing kindness, or better yet, participating in it. Daniel watched it unfold with a sense of wonder and gratitude. He'd done one small thing, gotten up from his seat, and walked across a room. And somehow, it had grown into something he never could have imagined. One Saturday morning, about 3 months after that first breakfast, Sarah found him at his usual spot at the counter. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. "Always." She slid onto the stool beside him, her face serious. "I got a new job, a real job. The county housing office hired me as a caseworker. I'm going to be helping families like mine, families who are struggling, who don't know where to turn." Daniel felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Sarah, that's wonderful." "It's because of you," she said. "All of it. If you hadn't gotten up that morning, if you hadn't sat down at my table, I don't know where I'd be right now. Probably back in Ohio, back with Marcus, because I wouldn't have had any other choice. You had choices. You just needed someone to remind you of that. That's exactly what you did." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "I want you to have this." Daniel opened the envelope and found a photograph inside. It was Emma, grinning from ear to ear, standing in front of a tiny Christmas tree in what must have been their apartment. She was wearing a new dress, and she looked healthy and happy and whole. On the back of the photograph, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Because of you, I have a life worth wishing for. Thank you for believing in us. Love, Emma." Daniel's vision blurred with tears. He cleared his throat, trying to compose himself, but it was no use. "I'm going to keep this forever," he managed. "I thought you might." Sarah smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes and transforms the whole face. "Danny, can I ask you something? Anything? That story you told me, about the groceries on your porch when you were a kid. You said you never found out who did it." "That's right." Sarah's smile widened. "I think I might know who it was." Daniel looked at her, confused. "What do you mean? You weren't even born then." "No, but I've been talking to people around town, asking questions, trying to understand how Cedar Falls became the kind of place it is." She paused, letting the moment build. Mrs. Patterson told me a story about her husband before he passed, about how he used to work at the grocery store back in the day, about how he had a habit of loading up bags of food and leaving them on porches when he knew families were struggling. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. Mr. Patterson, she said he never told anyone, never wanted credit, just did it because he thought it was right. Sarah reached over and touched Daniel's hand. He's been gone for a while now, but his kindness is still alive. It's alive in you, Danny, in what you do, in what you're teaching everyone else to do. Daniel sat in silence, processing this revelation. All these years, he'd wondered. All these years, he'd tried to pay forward a gift from an anonymous donor. And now, finally, he knew. Harold Patterson, the quiet man with the gentle eyes who'd run the grocery store on Main Street, who'd shared a pew with Daniel's family at church every Sunday, who'd never once mentioned what he'd done, never once expected thanks. "Does Mrs. Patterson know?" Daniel asked. "That I'm the kid whose family he helped?" "I didn't tell her. I thought that should come from you, if you want to." Daniel nodded slowly. "I think I do. I think it's time." That afternoon, Daniel drove to Mrs. Patterson's blue house with the white shutters. She answered the door with a surprised smile, invited him in for tea, and listened as he told her the story he'd been carrying for 40 years. By the end, they were both crying. "He would have been so pleased," Helen Patterson said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "So pleased to know it mattered. He always worried, worried that he wasn't doing enough, that the small things didn't really make a difference." "They make all the difference," Daniel said. "Mrs. Patterson, your husband saved my family, and because of what he did for us, I was able to help Sarah and Emma, and now Sarah is helping other families. It's like ripples in a pond, one act of kindness spreading out, touching more and more people." Helen smiled, that wise smile of someone who had lived long enough to see the patterns in life. "That's how it works, Danny. That's the secret nobody talks about. We think we're alone, making our little choices, living our little lives, but we're all connected. Everything we do matters. Every kindness, every cruelty, every moment of courage or cowardice, it all ripples out into the world." "I wish I could thank him," Daniel said. "I wish I could tell him what his gift meant." "You just did," Helen replied. "You just did." The snow fell that winter, deep and silent, blanketing Cedar Falls in white. Christmas came and went, marked by celebrations and gatherings, and the particular warmth of a community that knew how to take care of its own. Daniel spent Christmas Eve with his family, surrounded by his wife and daughters and their families, his house overflowing with laughter and love, and the chaos of grandchildren running through the halls. It was everything he'd ever wanted, everything he'd worked his whole life to build. Catherine and her husband had arrived from Minneapolis the day before, their 5-year-old son bouncing with excitement about Santa Claus and presents and everything Christmas represented to a child his age. Susan and her husband had driven up from St. Paul that morning, their car packed with gifts wrapped in shiny paper, and their hearts full of the particular joy that comes from coming home. The Morrison house had never looked more beautiful. Margaret had spent weeks decorating, stringing lights along the eaves, setting up the nativity scene that had belonged to her grandmother, arranging the tree just so with ornaments collected over 30 years of marriage. Each ornament had a story, a memory, a piece of their shared history hanging on those branches. There was the angel Catherine had made in first grade, lopsided and covered in glitter that still managed to shed every year. There was the wooden firefighter ornament Susan had given Daniel the year he'd been promoted to captain. There was the Our First Christmas ornament from 1985, slightly faded now, but still occupying a place of honor near the top of the tree. But Daniel kept thinking about Sarah and Emma, kept wondering how they were spending their holiday, whether they had everything they needed, whether they felt the embrace of community, even in their small apartment. After the Christmas Eve service at church, where they'd sung carols by candlelight and listened to Pastor Erickson talk about the importance of kindness and charity, Daniel made a decision. He whispered something to Margaret, who smiled and nodded, and then he slipped away to his truck. On Christmas morning, after the presents were opened and the breakfast was eaten, Daniel made an excuse and drove across town to Sarah's place. He'd brought gifts for Emma, toys and books that his granddaughter had helped him pick out, and something for Sarah too, a framed photograph of the Cedar Falls Fire Department, all the men and women Daniel had worked with over the years, with a plaque that read, "Family isn't always blood." Sarah opened the door in a bathrobe, her hair tousled, clearly surprised to see him. "Danny? What are you doing here? It's Christmas morning." "Just wanted to drop some things off," he said, suddenly feeling foolish. "Make sure you two are doing okay." Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she saw the gifts. "Danny, you didn't have to do this. I know. I wanted to." She invited him in, and he spent an hour watching Emma play with her new toys while Sarah made coffee, and they talked about everything and nothing. It was comfortable, familiar, like they'd known each other for years instead of months. Before he left, Sarah walked him to the door. "You've changed my life, Danny Morrison. You know that, right? Everything is different now because of what you did." "You changed your own life," Daniel said. "I just got up from my chair. You did all the hard work. But you got up. That's the thing. You got up when you could have stayed seated. You walked over when you could have looked away. You sat down when you could have kept walking." She shook her head slowly. "Don't underestimate what that meant. What it still means." Daniel thought about that conversation all the way home, thought about it for days afterward, during the quiet lull between Christmas and New Year's, when the town seemed to hold its breath waiting for the calendar to turn. How many times in his life had he stayed seated? How many opportunities for kindness had he missed because getting up seemed too hard, too awkward, too risky? He couldn't count them, couldn't even begin to estimate, but he could make a choice about the future. He could choose to always get up. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear, the stars brilliant against the black velvet sky. Daniel and Margaret attended the party at the fire station, surrounded by colleagues and friends, celebrating another year survived and another year ahead. The station had been decorated for the occasion, streamers and balloons, and a banner that read, "Happy New Year" in glittering letters. Someone had set up a table of appetizers, and someone else had brought a punch bowl that was rumored to contain more than just fruit juice. The firefighters and their families mingled and laughed and shared stories, the bonds of brotherhood strengthened by another year of serving together. Daniel moved through the crowd, accepting handshakes and hugs, listening to the same jokes he'd heard 100 times before, and laughing as if they were fresh. This was his family, these men and women who ran toward danger while everyone else ran away. He loved them with a fierce, uncomplicated love that had only grown stronger over the years. But even amid the celebration, his mind kept drifting back to that morning at the diner, to Sarah's face when the community had wrapped itself around her, to Emma's smile when she'd blown out those candles, to the feeling of rightness that had settled into his bones and hadn't left. At 11:30, he stepped outside for some fresh air. The cold was bracing, a shock after the warmth of the crowded station, but it felt good, clarifying. He stood on the steps and looked up at the stars, thinking about the year that was ending and the year that was about to begin. Margaret found him there a few minutes later, wrapping her arm through his. "You're missing the countdown," she said. "Just needed a minute." He pulled her close, sharing his warmth. "It's been quite a year." "It has. A good one, though, all things considered." "Yeah, a good one." At midnight, as the fireworks exploded over Cedar Falls and everyone cheered and embraced, Daniel held his wife close and made a silent resolution to see people, really see them. To notice the ones who were struggling, the ones who were invisible, the ones who were one bad break away from falling through the cracks. To get up, always get up, no matter how awkward or uncomfortable it might feel. To be worthy of Harold Patterson's groceries. To pay forward the gift that had been given to him so long ago. a gift that was still rippling outward, still touching lives, still changing the world, one small kindness at a time. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, looking up at him with those blue eyes. "Everything," Daniel said, "and nothing, just grateful, I guess. For all of it. That's a good way to start a new year. It's the only way to start a new year." They watched the fireworks together, holding hands like teenagers, as the old year died and the new year was born. And Daniel Morrison, fire captain, 52 years old, husband and father and grandfather, made a promise to himself that he would keep for the rest of his life. He would always get up. The following spring, Daniel received a letter that would become one of his most treasured possessions. It was from Emma, now almost 6 years old, dictated to her mother and written in Sarah's careful handwriting. "Dear Danny," it read, "thank you for having breakfast with me on my birthday. The pancakes were yummy. Thank you for being nice to my mommy. She smiles a lot now. She says it's because of you and all the nice people in Cedar Falls. I like it here. I have a friend named Sophie, and we play together every day. My mommy has a good job now, and she helps other mommies and their kids. She says that's because you showed her how to be brave. I think you are very brave too. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. I want to help people who are sad and make them happy. Thank you for my birthday. It was the best one ever. Love, Emma." Daniel read the letter at his usual spot at Rosie's counter, and he wasn't ashamed to admit that he cried. Rosie brought him extra napkins without comment, and Jenny pretended not to notice, and the other customers went about their business while a 52-year-old fire captain wept over a child's letter. Some things were worth crying about. Some things were too beautiful not to. He framed the letter and hung it in his office at the fire station, right next to his commendations and certifications and the photograph of his first fire crew from 30 years ago. When people asked about it, he told them the story, told them about Sarah and Emma, about the expired cake, about the way a community had come together to lift up a struggling family. And every time he told the story, he saw something change in the listener's face, a softening, a recognition, a resolve, because that's what stories do. They spread, they inspire, they remind us of who we can be when we choose to be our best selves. Daniel Morrison told that story for the rest of his life. Told it at fire department events, at community gatherings, at family dinners. Told it to his grandchildren as they grew, watching their eyes widen with the same wonder he'd felt that morning at Rosie's diner. And every time he told it, the ripples spread a little further. The years passed, as years do, bringing changes both welcome and bittersweet. Daniel retired from the fire department at 60 after 32 years of service. They threw him a party at the station, and half the town turned out to celebrate, and he gave a speech that he'd spent weeks preparing, but ended up abandoning halfway through because the prepared words didn't feel right. He stood at the podium in the station's main bay, surrounded by fire trucks and rescue equipment, looking out at the faces of people he'd known his whole life. His wife sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. His daughters flanked her, proud and tearful. His grandson, now 8 years old, wore a tiny fire department T-shirt and looked up at his grandfather with undisguised adoration. The prepared speech had been full of statistics: how many fires fought, how many lives saved, how many awards received. It had seemed important when he was writing it, a way to sum up a career that had defined his life. But now, standing in front of everyone who mattered to him, the numbers felt empty, meaningless. They didn't capture what he really wanted to say, so he set aside his notes and spoke from the heart. "I've spent my life running into burning buildings," he said instead, speaking from the heart. "And I'm proud of that. Proud of every life we saved, every fire we fought, every moment of danger we faced together. But if I'm honest, the thing I'm most proud of isn't any of that. It's a Saturday morning at Rosie's diner when I got up from my chair and walked across the room to sit with a stranger." A murmur went through the crowd. Most of them knew the story. It had become part of local legend, retold so many times that some details had probably been embellished along the way. But hearing Daniel reference it now, in this context, gave it new weight. The crowd was silent, hanging on his words. "That's the thing about courage," Daniel continued. "We think it has to be big. We think it has to be dramatic. Running into a burning building, risking your life, facing down death. But real courage, the kind that matters most, is often much smaller than that. It's getting up when staying seated would be easier. It's speaking up when staying silent would be safer. It's seeing someone who's struggling and choosing to do something about it, even when you don't know what to say or whether your help will be welcome." He looked out at the faces of his community, the people he'd known his whole life, the people who had shaped him and supported him and loved him through everything. Harold Patterson taught me that lesson, though I didn't know it at the time. A bag of groceries on a porch, that's all it was, but it saved my family, and it inspired me to try to save others, not just from fires, but from loneliness, from despair, from the feeling that nobody sees you, nobody cares, nobody would notice if you disappeared. He paused, gathering himself. We all have the power to be Harold Patterson. Every single day, we have opportunities to leave groceries on someone's porch, to see the invisible, to sit down with the lonely, to remind each other that we matter, that we're not alone, that this world can be kind if we choose to make it so. He raised his glass, and the crowd raised theirs with him. "To Harold Patterson," Daniel said, "and to everyone who chooses to get up." The toast echoed through the fire station, carried by voices young and old, and Daniel Morrison knew that his legacy wasn't the fires he'd fought or the medals he'd earned. His legacy was this moment and all the moments that would follow, as the people of Cedar Falls carried forward the simple, profound lesson he'd tried to teach them. Kindness matters. Courage is a choice, and the ripples never stop spreading. Sarah Mitchell was there that night, standing near the back with Emma, now a teenager with her mother's dark hair and her own fierce determination. They'd stayed in Cedar Falls, become part of the fabric of the community, and Sarah's work with the county housing office had helped dozens of families find their footing. After the speech, Sarah made her way through the crowd to find Daniel. "That was beautiful," she said, hugging him tightly. "Thank you for everything, then and now." "Thank you for letting me be part of your story," Daniel replied. Emma stepped forward, no longer the shy 5-year-old in mismatched mittens, but a confident young woman with plans and dreams of her own. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know something. I'm applying to nursing school next year. I want to work with kids, with families who are struggling. I want to do what you did for us." Daniel's eyes filled with tears for the 100th time that evening. "Emma, that's wonderful. You're going to be amazing. It's because of you," she said simply. "You showed me what kindness looks like. You showed me that one person can make a difference. I've never forgotten that." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I wanted to give you this. I've been saving it for the right moment." Daniel opened the envelope and found a photograph inside. It was the original picture Sarah had given him years ago, the one of Emma in front of the tiny Christmas tree. But now there was a second photograph attached to it. This one showed Emma in her high school graduation cap and gown, beaming at the camera, holding a sign that read, "I got up." The words hit Daniel like a wave, and he had to steady himself against the nearest table. "I got up," Emma explained, "just like you taught me. Every time I see someone struggling, every time I see someone invisible, I get up, I walk over, I sit down. I ask if I can join them." She smiled, that same innocent smile he remembered from that first birthday breakfast. "You started something, Mr. Morrison, and it's never going to stop." Daniel held both photographs close to his chest, unable to speak, overcome with a gratitude so profound it felt like drowning and flying at the same time. This was his legacy. Not the fires, not the medals, not the years of service. This, a little girl who had learned to get up, a ripple that would keep spreading forever. The final years of Daniel Morrison's life were quiet and full. He spent his days with Margaret, tending their garden, playing with their grandchildren, taking long walks through the town that had raised him and loved him and shaped him into who he was. The garden became his new passion, a peaceful counterpart to the chaos of his firefighting years. He grew tomatoes and peppers and squash, experimenting with different varieties, learning the rhythms of planting and harvesting that were so different from the adrenaline-fueled rhythms of emergency response. Margaret teased him about becoming a farmer in his old age, but she loved seeing him content, loved watching him find new purpose in nurturing things rather than rescuing them. His grandchildren grew up knowing his story. They'd heard it so many times they could recite it by heart, the tale of the expired cake and the birthday pancakes and the community that came together to help a stranger. They understood, in ways that children often understand things better than adults, that the story wasn't really about the breakfast. It was about seeing people, about choosing kindness, about getting up when staying seated would be easier. Rosie's diner remained his Saturday morning ritual, even after Rosie herself passed away and Jenny took over completely. He sat at the same counter stool, ordered the same breakfast, and watched as the tradition he'd accidentally started continued to flourish. Every Saturday, someone got up. Someone walked across the room. Someone sat down with a stranger and said, "Mind if I join you?" It had become part of Cedar Falls' identity, as much as the Fall Festival or the Christmas lights on Main Street. Newcomers learned about it quickly, drawn into the culture of kindness that permeated everything. "That's just how we do things here," old-timers would explain. "We look out for each other." Daniel watched it all with wonder and gratitude, still amazed that one small act could grow into something so large. On his final Saturday morning, Daniel woke early as always, kissed his sleeping wife, and drove to the diner in the grey light of dawn. He ordered his usual breakfast, drank his usual coffee, and talked to Jenny about her kids and the weather and the new family that had moved into the old Henderson place. And then he saw her, a young woman, maybe 30, sitting alone in the back booth. She was staring at the menu with that particular intensity he recognized immediately. The intensity of someone calculating prices against the contents of their wallet. The intensity of someone trying to figure out how to make not enough stretch far enough. Daniel felt his body respond before his mind had fully processed what he was seeing. He was already standing, already picking up his coffee, already walking toward the back of the diner. His knees ached these days, and his back wasn't what it used to be. He was 81 years old, and the walk across the diner felt longer than it ever had before. But he made it. He slid into the booth across from the young woman, setting his mug on the table with hands that trembled slightly from age, but not from doubt. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Eating breakfast alone gets boring after a while. The young woman looked up at him, surprise and wariness warring in her eyes. I wasn't going to order anything. I was just looking at the menu. I'll leave." "You'll do no such thing," Daniel said firmly. "I'm going to order you the biggest breakfast on this menu, and you're going to eat every bite. And then you're going to tell me your story, and I'm going to listen, and together we're going to figure out how to help." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Daniel smiled. The same smile he'd given Sarah Mitchell all those years ago. The same smile that had started everything. "Because it's what we do here," he said. "We look out for each other. That's what Cedar Falls is all about." And as he said the words, he felt it, the rightness of this moment, the perfect symmetry of ending where he'd begun, the knowledge that the ripples would keep spreading long after he was gone. Daniel Morrison died peacefully in his sleep that night, with Margaret holding his hand and his children gathered around. The doctors said his heart just stopped, the way old hearts sometimes do, worn out from a lifetime of beating, but the people who knew him best said something different. They said his heart was too full to hold any more love. They said he'd done what he came to do. They said he'd gotten up one last time, and then he'd finally been able to rest. The funeral was the largest Cedar Falls had ever seen. People came from all over the state, all over the country, people whose lives had been touched by Daniel Morrison's simple philosophy of kindness. Sarah Mitchell gave the eulogy, her voice steady and strong, speaking of that first Saturday morning and everything that had followed. Emma, now a registered nurse working in the pediatric ward of the county hospital, sat in the front row with her own daughter on her lap. A daughter she'd named Rose, after the diner where everything had changed. Daniel Morrison taught us that courage isn't just about running into burning buildings, Sarah said from the podium. It's about getting up. Every day, in 1,000 small ways, choosing to get up and walk across the room towards someone who needs you. That's the legacy he left us. Not just the fires he fought, but the lives he touched, the kindness he sparked. The ripples he set in motion that will keep spreading forever. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people young and old, strangers and friends, all united by the memory of one man's simple act of courage. So I'm asking you today, in his memory, to get up. See the invisible, sit with the lonely, ask someone if you can join them, and then really listen when they tell you their story. That's how we honor Daniel Morrison. That's how we keep his legacy alive. The congregation rose as one, a standing ovation for a man who would never hear it, but who had earned every moment of it. And in the back of the church, unnoticed by almost everyone, a young woman slipped out the door. She'd wandered in off the street, drawn by the crowd, curious about what was happening. She'd listened to the eulogy, heard the story of expired cake and birthday pancakes, and a firefighter who got up when everyone else stayed seated. She was tired. She was struggling. She was invisible. But as she walked back out into the sunlight, something had shifted inside her, something small but significant, a spark of hope where before there had only been darkness. Maybe the world could be kind after all. Maybe someone would see her. Maybe, when the time came, she would be the one to get up. The ripples continued to spread. They always would. Because that's how kindness works. One act, one moment, one choice to get up and walk across the room, and suddenly the whole world changes, not all at once. Not in dramatic, earth-shattering ways that make headlines and win awards, but in small, quiet ways that accumulate over time like snowflakes building into drifts. Each act of kindness creates another, and another, and another, until what started as a single gesture becomes a movement, a culture, a way of being that defines an entire community. Daniel Morrison knew that. He had lived it, breathed it, embodied it for decades, and now so did everyone else. In the years that followed, Rosie's Diner became something of a pilgrimage site. People came from all over to see the place where it all started, to sit in the booth where Daniel had sat with Sarah and Emma, to order the birthday pancakes and feel connected to something larger than themselves. Jenny kept the tradition alive, keeping the same menu, the same atmosphere, the same spirit of welcome that had defined the diner since her mother opened it 50 years ago. On the wall behind the counter, she hung Daniel's photograph right next to Rosie's, and underneath it a small plaque with the words he'd spoken so many times. Mind if I join you? Eating breakfast alone gets boring after a while. Every Saturday morning, without fail, someone would reenact the moment, would get up from their seat, walk across the room, and sit down with a stranger. Sometimes it led to lifelong friendships. Sometimes it led to practical help, jobs and housing and resources for people who needed them. Sometimes it just led to a pleasant conversation and a shared meal. But always, always, it led to something good. Margaret Morrison lived another 10 years after Daniel's passing, never remarrying, content with her memories and her family, and the knowledge that her husband's legacy was alive and well in the community they'd loved. On her own final morning, she visited Rosie's Diner one last time, sat at Daniel's counter stool, ordered his usual breakfast, and when a young man came in looking lost and alone, she did what Daniel would have done. She got up, she walked across the room, she sat down and asked, "Mind if I join you?" The young man looked up at her, this tiny, silver-haired woman with bright blue eyes and a warm smile, and something shifted in his face. The wariness melted away. "The walls came down. I'd like that," he said. And so it continued, the endless dance of kindness and courage, of getting up and sitting down, of seeing the invisible and hearing the unspoken. One generation passing the torch to the next, the ripples spreading ever outward, touching lives that would never know where the kindness had started. That was Daniel Morrison's true legacy. Not a statue or a building or a scholarship in his name, though all of those existed too. His true legacy was simpler than that. It was the knowledge, planted in countless hearts, that getting up matters, that kindness is a choice, that one small act of courage can change the world, not all at once, but one breakfast at a time, one stranger at a time, one "mind if I join you" at a time. Forever and ever, rippling outward into eternity, the way love always does. And so the story continues, passed from generation to generation, from heart to heart, from one Saturday morning breakfast to the next. It is a simple story, really. A man gets up from his chair, he walks across a room, he sits down with a stranger and asks if he can join her. But simple stories are often the most powerful. They remind us that heroism doesn't require superpowers or extraordinary circumstances. It just requires the willingness to see another person's pain and respond with compassion, the willingness to get uncomfortable, the willingness to get up. Daniel Morrison understood that truth. He lived it every day of his life. And because he did, countless others learned to live it too. That is his legacy, that is his gift to the world, that is the ripple that will never stop spreading long after the last person who knew him personally has passed from this earth. Because kindness, true kindness, is immortal. It lives on in every act of compassion it inspires. It lives on in every stranger who becomes a friend. It lives on in every child who learns that the world can be kind, that people can be good, that love is stronger than fear. Daniel Morrison lit a flame when he got up from that counterstool on a cold December morning, and that flame will burn forever.